Welcome. We're getting everybody settled. We're expecting a pretty good turnout, and so people are still kind of popping in and joining us. But while we're getting settled, I'm going to change this up a little. Why don't you tell us what your favorite tree is in the chat? And while we're going through this, there's just some basic housekeeping. I think a lot of people have participated before, so you've probably heard all of this, but we are recording tonight's session and the speakers will be spotlighted throughout the presentation. You will not be on the recording if you stay on camera, but if you will be seen by everybody tonight. If you don't want that to happen, please just change your setting to speaker view and take your camera down. For the best viewing experience, we do recommend speaker view. That will put your speaker front and center, and you'll be able to see Hannah during her presentation. For closed captions, if you go to the bottom of the screen, on the pop-up screen, select the three dots and select captions as an option. All viewers are going to be muted throughout the presentation, and we are taking questions in the chat, and they'll be addressed at the end of the presentation. And now for the formal part of our presentation. We want to welcome you to Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds. I'm Joyce Lights, Executive Director of Connecticut Audubon Society. And before I invite Lori Lichtenauer to introduce Hannah Clipp, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you. You are the backbone of this organization. Your passion and mission for conservation really makes it possible for us to do all that we do. We manage over 3,400 acres of habitat, and that's all been entrusted to us. And Laura's going to give you a little bit more details of how we manage some of our forest habitats. But your efforts and your passion about this really is what inspires us to keep doing it. Seeing Both the Forest and the Trees is a title that describes our efforts to protect threatened species throughout Connecticut. And we partner locally, regionally, and nationally on these efforts. Making sure that these habitats remain vital for breeding and migratory birds really guides everything that we do. And now I'd like to invite Lori Lichtenauer, one of Connecticut Audubon Society sanctuary managers, to introduce Hannah Clipp. Lori?
All right, thanks, Joyce. And thank you so much to everyone for tuning in for tonight's presentation. Like Joyce said, my name is Lori Lichtenauer, and I'm the sanctuary manager and naturalist at Deer Pond Farm, which is in Sherman, Connecticut. If you haven't been, you've got to come visit us. So as a sanctuary manager for Deer Pond Farm, my job is to steward the 850 acres and 15 miles of trails at Deer Pond Farm. So as a forester and a birder, I'm always looking for the best possible ways to steward land to meet the needs of wildlife and also of people. So conservation is really the first step in land stewardship. Conserving the land keeps it from being developed, but stewardship is the act of planning and management of these natural resources. And so land managers are tasked with making decisions about how best to care for the land to meet the goals of fostering wildlife biodiversity, safe and passive recreation, and resilience to climate change. And this often happens through a stewardship plan created by a forester and/or wildlife biologists. And so the late Kathy and Walter Riston, who owned the Deer Pond Farm property before they bequeathed it to Connecticut Audubon, set a really great precedent for stewardship on the land by working with foresters, conservation organizations, and ecologists to create a forest stewardship plan. And so me and the team at Deer Pond Farm are really trying to continue that work today. And foresters often create stewardship plans with recommendations of forestry practices. These things can include invasive species management, timber harvests, timber stand improvements, tree plantings, and many other prescriptions. And so these practices are important tools not only for extracting forest products safely and sustainably, but they also enhance the biodiversity of our forests. And so creating openings in the canopy can add light to the forest floor, increasing the growth of new trees, herbaceous species, shrubby materials. And so those diverse plant communities can support diverse insects, which can then just support diverse wildlife species. And so forests are dynamic ecosystems, which means that they're constantly changing. They've evolved to survive floods and hurricanes, fires, ice storms, a lot of the things that we've experienced in the last few weeks, and lots of other different kinds of disturbances. And forests are dynamic ecosystems that are adapted for this change. And a lot of these forestry practices complement these adaptations. And so research also plays an incredibly important role in land management. Research, like Dr. Clipp is going to speak about tonight, examines how wildlife populations are responding to a lot of these management decisions on a quantitative basis. So she'll discuss 3 different research projects that she conducted in the Northeast and in the Appalachian Mountain regions regarding how birds are responding to these different types of forestry practices. And so research like this is really invaluable to land managers like me and to private landowners across Connecticut who own most of the undeveloped land in the state. So land stewardship is complex. It takes the work of private landowners, conservation organizations, foresters, research ecologists, native plant nurseries, ground crews, and volunteers. And so learning how to best steward the land for birds, other wildlife, it's a responsibility that we can all take part in as Connecticut Audubon members. So thank you so much to all of you for tuning in, and thank you to Dr. Clipp for sharing her knowledge with us tonight. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Clipp for her speech this evening.
All right, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my presentation. Okay, just making sure everyone can see that. Everything looks good.
We're good.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm really honored that I was invited to speak to everyone this evening about some of the research that I've been doing involving birds, forests, and climate change. As Lori said, my name is Hannah, and I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow working with the United States Forest Service. So instead of diving straight into the research, I did want to first give kind of a brief overview of my background and how I attained the wild about birds aspect of this speaker series. My flight path, if you will, to becoming both a birder and bird researcher. There we go. Okay. All right. So I grew up in suburban Maryland in a family that didn't really do outdoorsy type things. So there's no camping, no hunting, fishing, or birding. We didn't even really go on hikes as a family. But despite that, all throughout childhood, I was always fascinated by animals. Although I will admit that most of my attention and knowledge was focused on the what's called charismatic megafauna, so like the big cats, the wolves, raptors, the type of animals that get featured in animal documentaries on TV or that can be found in the Baltimore Zoo. And it wasn't until almost my senior year of high school that I'd even discovered that wildlife biology is a career. I had previously thought that to work with animals, you had to be a vet or a zookeeper, and I didn't really want to do either of those two things. I thought that being a wildlife biologist sounded awesome, so I ended up majoring in wildlife biology at West Virginia University in Morgantown, West Virginia, and I learned a lot in the first few years of my classes. I was taught about North American wildlife species and wildlife management, and I was introduced to the birding community for the first time. Some fellow students brought me along on my first Christmas bird count, and I began to volunteer at a bird rehab center. However, it took until the summer after my sophomore year before I really became a quote-unquote true birder and had my first taste of bird research. During that summer, I participated in the Research Experiences for Undergraduates program at Kansas State University. This is a program that's funded by the National Science Foundation, and it offers summer research opportunities to undergraduate students, especially those who don't have as much experience. I was paired with a Ph.D. student and got involved with a project studying grassland songbirds at Kanza Prairie. And through that experience, grassland songbirds became my spark birds, and I added wildlife research and graduate school to my list of career goals. After graduating from West Virginia University, I went straight to the University of Delaware and worked on a master's degree in wildlife ecology. For my master's thesis, I actually studied stopover ecology, which, if you were here for the last talk, is the same topic of that previous speaker in the series. And so just like Freda, I used weather surveillance radars to look at stopover distributions of migratory land birds, although my study region was concentrated on the Gulf Coast. And then for my PhD, I benefited again from the National Science Foundation and was awarded an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, which I used to return to Morgantown and join the West Virginia Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at West Virginia University. My dissertation research investigated the effects of climate change and forest management on bird communities and populations in the Appalachian Mountains, which is the first part of the research that I'll cover this evening. Since graduating with my PhD degree in 2023, I've stayed in Morgantown working in a postdoctoral position with the Forest Service. In collaboration with Forest Service scientists, I've been studying how climate change may impact habitat availability for birds in the future, and that'll be the final part of the research in this presentation. I mentioned that I started birding as an undergraduate student, and I've been an avid birder since then. I'm still working on adding data to eBird, but these numbers and map give kind of a glimpse of where I've birded in the past 10 years. And except for the Florida scrub jay here in the corner, the photos displayed here are birds that I've photographed since the start of this year, including the common gull in Stamford, Connecticut. And over time, I've found that birding as a hobby pairs really well with my bird research. As a birder, I might ask, where will I find a certain species? Or what species might I find at a particular location? And as a bird researcher, I basically expand that question to larger regions or longer time periods, looking for patterns and trends, and then investigating what is driving those patterns or trends. So for instance, what is the range of a certain bird species and why? What determines where a bird occurs? And this question is the underlying core of a lot of my recent research. Let's take a look at where wood thrushes occur as an example. So here we have a map from eBird of wood thrush abundance during the breeding season, and the darker shades of red indicate higher abundances. So wood thrush is a forest songbird species that can be found throughout both Connecticut and West Virginia, and it's relatively broadly distributed in most of the eastern states. Compare that to the black-throated blue warbler, also a forest songbird, but with a much more limited distribution within the eastern states. Black-throated blue warblers can be found in the mountains of West Virginia, so this strip here, assuming you can see my cursor, and in parts of northern Connecticut. But if we go back to the original question, what determines where a bird occurs? What factors might be driving wood thrush versus black-throated blue warbler abundance? And what is causing their distributions to diverge? Being forest songbirds, forest cover is one pretty obvious answer to what determines where these two bird species occur. So forest birds need forest, which explains, why neither species are in the Great Plains area of the country, but they can both be found in Connecticut, which is about 60% forested, and West Virginia, which is almost 80% forested. And if we really want to drill down deeper, both bird species are likely to be additionally influenced by finer scale vegetation factors, such as forest type, tree species, and stand structure. However, forest cover alone doesn't entirely explain the distributions of either wood thrushes or black-throated blue warblers. Zooming out, climate is another factor that has a powerful influence on where birds occur. It doesn't matter if forest exists if it's too cold to survive, which is why wood thrushes and black-throated blue warblers migrate south for the winter. A striking example that underscores the role of climate in defining bird ranges is the story of the great black hawk in Maine. So for those of you who may not be familiar with this story, The great blackhawk, pictured here, was the first individual of its species to be recorded in the United States. It showed up in Maine in August 2018, and then it settled in a local park in Maine in November. And now for context, this is crazy because great blackhawks are a neotropical species. Their range spans from South America to Mexico, and they're usually found hunting snakes and lizards in tropical forests and wetlands. And so this individual was able to find forest habitat as well as food in the form of squirrels, which is this unfortunate patch of fur right here. But it just wasn't adapted for such a cold climate. So think Maine in the winter for a tropical bird. And it did eventually die with frostbite on its legs in January. The death of the great blackhawk is an example of a direct effect of climate on determining bird ranges. Climate can also act indirectly through vegetation by influencing forest type and tree species distributions, and through food resources by influencing insect distributions, for instance, and all of which in turn affects where birds occur. And so through these direct and indirect effects, climate dictates the breeding range of forest birds at a broad scale. However, the relationship with climate isn't the same for all birds, which explains why there's pretty wide variation in ranges among species. So here's an example of what I would deem a cold-associated species, the blackpoll warbler, which is a forest songbird whose breeding range favors colder environments. So they aren't generally found, for instance, breeding in Connecticut. They're up further north in Canada. Going back to black-throated blue warblers, they would also be considered a cold-associated species, although maybe not to the same extent as blackpoll warblers. You can find black-throated blue warblers breeding in Connecticut and down through the Appalachian Mountains, where cooler temperatures prevail at higher elevations. The black-throated blue warblers in the southern Appalachians, so this kind of red patch here, are called trailing edge populations, as they're at the margins or the outskirts of the species' overall range. And then you have what I would call warm-associated species, like the Kentucky warbler, that are associated with relatively warmer environments within the eastern United States. And so they generally won't be found breeding as far north as Connecticut. Given the range of temperatures throughout North America, these species would actually have a positive relationship with higher temperatures. So looking to the future, there's a lot of uncertainty for what may happen to birds if and when the climate changes. Using black-throated blue warblers as an example, will rising temperatures, including temperatures that reach this kind of upper bound or upper range of their tolerance, cause their southern trailing edge populations to disappear? And then here in West Virginia, should we expect to see fewer black-throated blue warblers breeding in our high elevation forests in the future? And what about Connecticut? If temperatures keep warming, will Connecticut eventually lose black-throated blue warblers? According to a National Audubon Society study on climate change, there is a reason to be concerned. Under a warming scenario of 3 degrees Celsius, black-throated blue warbler is one of 27 highly vulnerable species in Connecticut during the breeding season, along with other generally cold-associated species, including black Burnian warbler, Canada warbler, dark-eyed junco, hermit thrush, and blue-headed vireo. At the same time, a changing climate may allow warm-associated species and climate generalist species to potentially expand their populations northward. The National Audubon Society study identified 60 species in Connecticut that would remain stable or even perhaps benefit under a warming scenario of 3 degrees Celsius. And some of those birds include warbling vireo, mourning dove, blue jay, northern cardinal, gray catbird, and northern mockingbird. But before we go too deep into predictions of the future, I think it would be good for us to kind of take a step back and be on the same page regarding climate change, what we know, and what we expect. So this is probably a review for most, if not all of you. But although global climate fluctuates normally over time, the past century has seen a distinct increase in temperatures. For example, this graph portrays temperature change in the United States relative to a long-term average, and it shows that temperatures have been increasing over time. Each of these bars corresponds to a year, with the blue bars representing relatively cooler annual temperatures, and red bars representing relatively warmer annual temperatures. And you can see that since the 1990s, annual temperatures have been consistently warmer than average. And this is true for annual temperatures in Connecticut as well, with the past 2 decades experiencing warmer than average temperatures. And the consequences of this are that warming temperatures and climate change as a whole can have direct impacts on individual birds by affecting survival and reproduction. Warming temperatures and increasing temperature variability can alter energy expenditure, thermoregulation, and incubation behavior, and increasing frequency and intensity of precipitation-related events, such as storms, floods, and droughts, can lower nest success, juvenile survival, and adult survival by causing direct mortality or death of nestlings and migrating birds. And so climate change can also have indirect impacts by altering the timing of vegetation budding dates and insect emergence, which can fall out of sync with the timing of bird reproduction. In general, birds have evolved to hatch their chicks during a period of high food abundance, but if insect populations, for instance, reach their peak earlier than usual, insect-eating birds may lose out on an important food resource. And for migratory species, the effects of climate change can compound from one part of their annual cycle to another, which is called carryover effects. As this figure illustrates, winter climate can have effects that carry over to the breeding season and actually affect nest success. And ultimately, studies have found that climate change is causing shifts in bird distributions as individuals and populations respond to these changes in temperature and precipitation patterns. Based on that knowledge, U.S. Forest Service scientists created a climate change bird atlas to predict what distributions might look like in the future. And so these maps are showing the modeled distribution of black-throated blue warblers in the eastern United States currently, so for the year 2000, and then in the future, projecting out to 2100 under a high emissions climate scenario. And you can see that the overall range for black-throated blue warblers is predicted to shrink slightly, and regional incidence is predicted to decrease throughout their range. So here you can see the changing color from the dark blues indicating a higher habitat suitability to a lighter green. And then that's verified if we look at the map, which is showing the actual difference between those two values. And we're seeing lots of oranges and reds indicating a negative relationship. And then cold-associated species in particular are predicted to be impacted for the worse by climate change. And that's pretty evident in these maps for Swainson's thrush. Under a high emissions climate scenario, the trailing edge populations of Swainson's thrush in the central Appalachian Mountains are predicted to almost disappear in the future. And even the northern populations seem to be greatly reduced in the future. So clearly, climate has a lot of influence on birds in terms of population dynamics and distributions, but climate change isn't the only future change to consider when thinking about bird conservation. Land cover and land uses are changing as well. And so here, this map is showing forest canopy loss from 1986 to 2010, where the purple is referring to removal, which is essentially timber harvest. And so forests appear to be pretty stable in Connecticut, lots of green here, but forests in the southeast United States have been subjected to a lot of timber harvest. And then looking forward and going beyond just forest cover, other types of land cover and land uses are predicted to change into the future. So in this map of land cover across the United States in 2000, red represents urban areas, shades of green represent forest, and shades of yellow and gold represent agriculture. And if we jump forward to 2100, this projection of future land cover is predicting quite a bit of urban development, especially in the eastern United States. For example, there's a notable increase in urban cover in Connecticut, which is particularly evident in the areas that I think are connecting New Haven and Hartford. So due to urbanization, forest cover may decrease into the future with obvious impacts to forest bird habitat. But it's important to remember that individual tree species themselves could also be shifting due to climate change. So these maps are from the US Forest Service Climate Change Tree Atlas, which is similar to the bird atlas that I previously showed. Here we're looking at black birch or sweet birch, and seeing that it does in fact persist in much of its modeled range between 2000 and 2100, but it does decline in abundance in the central part of its range, which is indicated by the orange values. And you can see it's also declining in parts of Connecticut. However, it is notably expanding into northward into Maine. So here we see the original distribution predicted for current times. And then in the future, we're seeing it pop up in the northern part of the Northeast. So into Maine and northern Vermont and New Hampshire. But just like with birds, not all trees respond the same way to climate change. These maps for northern red oak show that it's expected to increase in abundance in the central and southern Appalachians, and it is expected to expand northward into the northern and northeast states compared to its current distribution. All right, to summarize all of that information, which is a lot, climate is changing, land cover is changing, and tree distributions are potentially changing, all of which impacts birds directly and indirectly, causing them to shift their ranges. But what is the big fuss? Why should we care that birds are moving around, shifting on the landscape? Well, as many of you may already know, bird populations are experiencing consistent and widespread declines across North America. A study out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology back in 2019 found that we've lost about 2.9 billion birds, which is nearly 30% of the total bird population in the USA and Canada, in just the past 50 years. And many of those birds are songbirds that breed in the forests of eastern United States. And these population declines have cascading economic and ecological repercussions for local ecosystem function and forest communities. So global climate change isn't just moving birds around. It's one factor thought to be contributing to these declining bird populations. Clearly, birds need conservation action to be taken, but there are questions about climate change that need to be answered first in order to plan and prioritize those conservation actions. So over the past 5 years, I've worked to address 4 such questions through 3 different research studies, which I'll go through using black-throated blue warbler as sort of a case study. So going back to the familiar map of the breeding season abundance of black-throated blue warblers in eastern North America. During my PhD dissertation, I asked, are relationships with climate always the same, even if I look at populations in the northern, central, and southern Appalachians? And how does this distribution shift under future climate change? What is the additional impact of land cover changes? And then during the past year of my postdoc position, I've added another question. What is the additional impact of shifting tree distributions? But let's start with the first question. Are relationships with climate the same in different regions of a bird's range? To answer this question, I designed a study to quantify potential differences in how forest songbird species are influenced by climate factors across latitudinal and elevational gradients within the Appalachian Mountains. I used the Appalachian Mountains because of their expansive latitudinal and elevational gradients and their importance in shaping the breeding distributions of forest songbird species such as the black-throated blue warbler. The premise of the study was relatively simple. Do birds respond the same to climate factors at different latitudes and elevations? in which case we might expect similar response curves in the northern, central, and southern Appalachians. Or do their relationships with climate factors change along gradients in latitude and elevation? In which case we would expect those response curves to vary in magnitude and maybe direction. Sampling points for this study were located throughout 3 study regions within the Appalachian Mountains. Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in the White Mountains of New Hampshire represented the northern Appalachians. Monongahela National Forest in the Allegheny Mountains of West Virginia represented the central Appalachians. And then the Pisgah and Nantahala National Forests in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina represented the southern Appalachians. Without getting into too much detail, I compiled bird count data from more than 29,000 point count surveys that were conducted in the 3 study regions at 1,733 sampling points across a period of 28 years. And as you can see in these figures, the sampling points were spread across elevational gradients within each forest. Using this vast amount of data, I was able to model 40 forest songbird species and examine their relationships with 4 climate variables at high, mid, and low elevations in the northern, central, and southern Appalachians. One of the key results from this study was the finding that climate effects did in fact vary along both latitudinal and elevational gradients in the Appalachian Mountains. So on the left is a full figure of results for black-throated blue warbler. And on the right, I've pulled out the plots that show the relationship between abundance on the y-axis and mean breeding season temperature on the x-axis from low elevations in the northern, central, and southern Appalachians. And you can see that the relationship is negative at all 3 latitudes, which is expected. But the strength or the magnitude of the response changes as you go from north to south. And then on this slide, I've pulled out the plots that show that relationship between abundance and mean breeding season temperature from high, mid, and low elevations in just the southern Appalachians to look at the difference among elevations. And in this case, both the direction and the strength of the response actually changes depending on the elevation. In addition, we found that the highest magnitude effects, so the strongest effects, were consistently experienced near birds' range limits, where species are likely to be more sensitive to environmental changes. For example, mean temperature had the greatest impact on black-throated blue warbler at low elevations in the central and southern Appalachians. There was also a common trend among the focal study species, where the steepest negative effects from temperature occurred at low elevations in the southern Appalachians, which you can see is the case for black-throated blue warbler. And so what we're seeing is as temperature rises, abundance is falling pretty sharply. So what does this mean for forest songbirds in the Appalachian Mountains when climate changes in the future? I only covered the results for black-throated blue warbler here in this presentation, but based on all of the modeled responses to temperature, we found that cold-associated species, including black-throated blue warbler, black burning warbler, Canada warbler, least flycatcher, veery, and Swainson's thrush, those were most at risk from the potential effects of climate change. And you may note that many of these species are consistent with the vulnerable species in Connecticut that were identified by the National Audubon Society study that I mentioned earlier. Warming temperatures and increasing temperature variability could also potentially result in the steepest decreases in bird species, specifically at lower elevations in the southern Appalachians. However, to make precise predictions and identify exact regions where changes in cold-associated species may exceed particular thresholds, these results still need to be integrated with fine-scale maps of contemporary and future temperature and precipitation values. And so I tackle a bit of that in my next study, but to make actual predictions for the future, I wanted to be as realistic as possible. So for the second research question, I incorporated land cover and land cover change in addition to climate factors. So the purpose of this study was to combine climate and land cover metrics with bird survey data to first quantify the influence of climate versus land cover on the relative abundance and distributions of 14 forest songbird species in the Appalachian Mountains, and then to project future distributions in 2100 based on expected scenarios of climate change and land cover change. For this study, I focused on the Appalachian Mountains bird conservation region, which is shaded in dark gray on this map. And within the Appalachian Mountains bird conservation region, there are 322 North American breeding bird survey routes, and I obtained 20 years of count data from those routes, so spanning the years 1997 to 2017. From those data, I created models to understand the relative influence of climate versus land cover metrics on bird species abundance across the study region. In the study, I focused on 14 forest songbird species and assigned them to one of 3 climate classifications based on their breeding ranges within the Appalachian Mountains bird conservation region. So 5 were cold-associated species, including the black-footed blue warbler. 4 were warm-associated species, including the summer tanager. And 5 were climate generalist species, including the wood thrush. After reviewing the results of the 14 models, I actually found that proportions of land cover types tended to be more influential and had higher effect sizes than temperature or precipitation amounts. And so the difference in effect size is evident in these examples for 3 of the focal forest songbird species. So within each of these plots, the red line is representing the mean expected abundance, and then the 2 black lines represent the 95% credible interval, which just indicates the amount of uncertainty around that line. And you can see here that changes in forest cover, which are the bottom 3 plots, more strongly influenced each species' relative abundance compared to changes in temperature variables, the top 3 plots. And it's especially evident for wood thrush here at the end, where as we go an increase in deciduous forest, we see a sharp increase or a substantial increase in wood thrush abundance. Whereas as we, traverse the range of May to June temperature, there's a slight difference, but it's not as pronounced as it is with deciduous forest. And that makes sense. So using the models of those relationships with climate and land cover, I was able to then forecast bird species abundance into the future using 4 future climate and land cover combination scenarios. And I chose to look at 4 future scenarios because although broad trends are pretty consistent for future predictions, such as the expectation for temperatures to increase, as seen here, looking at June, the month of June temperature in 2000 versus 100 years later, and we're seeing a clear increase. However, the amount and geographical pattern of that predicted climate change depends on the scenario. For instance, higher levels of greenhouse gas emissions are projected to result in higher future temperatures, especially in the northern portion of the study region. So here we have 3 maps. The first map is the map of mean June temperature across the study region. And then in current times, so 2000, based on the year 2000. And then if we look 100 years in the future, the next 2 maps are showing the difference in temperature. And the difference for temperature is all positive, but here you can see under a high emission scenario, that difference is much higher than the low emission scenario. Similarly, the Appalachian Mountains are projected to experience a general increase in precipitation. So for example, in June, we are supposed to see kind of a general increase in the amount of precipitation during the month. But there are pretty distinct different regional patterns depending on that emission scenario. So here we have the same setup where we have mean June precipitation in this map mapped across the region. And then in the following 2 maps, it's the change in precipitation, where the brown and tan colors are indicating a decrease, so kind of a drying out. And then the blue to dark blue or purple is indicating an increase in precipitation, so a wetter future scenario. And then the greenhouse gas emission scenario also impacts the amount of predicted land cover change. So in general, projections indicate declines in forest and agricultural land cover and increases in urban cover over time. However, the increase in urban cover or developed land is greater under a higher emissions future scenario. So here we have the proportion of developed land, where the redder it is, the higher the amount of urban area. And then looking at the change in that proportion, we're seeing an increase, a mild increase under low emission scenario. And then if we look at the high emission scenario, we're seeing more red and darker red, indicating higher amounts of increases in the proportion of developed land. And a decline in forest cover is also more pronounced under the higher emissions future scenario. So here, gray is representing a loss of forest cover, and we're seeing a lot more gray and darker grays for the high emission scenario. So proceeding with the second part of my study, I used my models to predict contemporary and then future species counts using data from 2000 and then from the 4 future climate and land cover combination scenarios. And that produces maps that look like these, for example, black-throated blue warbler. And so here we see a map of the expected count, which is a measure of relative abundance for black-throated blue warbler in the year 2000 across the study region. And then the 4 future scenarios, from a coolest future scenario to a warmest future scenario. And you're not seeing a huge difference here, and that is indeed what we will find later. But once I generated these projections, I did quantify indices of change. So I looked at differences in the total relative abundance, differences in the overall range, and then shifts in the spatial center of the distributions from 2000 to 2100. And looking at the results, I found that the 5 cold-associated species were projected to experience slight declines in relative abundance, with the steepest declines for 3 of the 5 species concentrated in the southern portion of their ranges within the Appalachian Mountains bird conservation region. And you can see that pattern in these projections for black-throated blue warbler, where orange colors are representing declines in future relative abundance. So these are the same maps, but instead of showing the expected count, it's now showing the percent change. And so we're seeing the oranges or the declines in the southern part of their range within the study region. Meanwhile, relative abundance of the 4 warm-associated species was projected to either decline slightly, as in the case of summer tanager portrayed here, or remain similar in the future, and there were no significant changes in the overall range. And then finally, the 5 climate generalist species appear to be least affected by future climate and land cover changes. There was little to no change in the projected relative abundance or overall range, as seen for wood thrush in this figure, where a lot of the change is pretty minor, and there's not a big shift from the expected count in 2000 to 2100. And there were no significant shifts in their distribution. So overall, at a pretty broad spatiotemporal scale, so like a broad across space and time scale, the net projected impact from climate change in this region was actually pretty modest. So general climate conditions during the breeding season are not likely to change enough that birds can't tolerate those new climate conditions. However, considering the greater relative importance and higher effect sizes of land cover change on the focal forest songbird species, conservation efforts for those species in the Appalachian Mountains should probably incorporate prioritizing, preserving, and promoting mature forest cover. And so for my postdoctoral position, I delved even deeper and worked with the Forest Service scientists to investigate the influence of individual tree species and how they might affect bird distributions in the future. Forest birds are tied to trees for a number of reasons, including cover, shelter, roosting, and nesting habitat, as well as food resources, both directly, for example, in the form of pine cones and berries, which are hard to see, but they are there in these two birds' bills, and indirectly, such as caterpillars, like in this black-throated blue warbler's bill, and other flying insects that feed or live on the trees. So for this study, we looked at 107 bird species, and again used breeding bird survey data to model their distributions as a function of climate and terrain variables. And then we ran a second set of models with metrics for 46 tree species, including both conifer and deciduous species, in order to quantify the additional value of the tree species information. And just like in the last study, we then modeled future distributions, this time of habitat suitability at decadal time steps, so at the period of decades, and using 3 scenarios of change. One where only climate change was included, one where trees were added, but we used their current distributions, which we referred to as static tree species, so here in this legend. And then one where trees were added, but we allowed their distributions to shift with climate change at a lagged time step, which we refer to as lagged tree species change. So from those projections, we were able to produce plots like this one for black-throated blue warbler, where on the x-axis, we have years from 2000 to 2100, and then on the y-axis is total incidence, which just refers to habitat suitability. So higher numbers means more habitat suitability, and lower numbers mean no habitat suitability. And then each of these dots represents the predicted total incidence for each decade, and then the corresponding lines are the overall trajectories, with the colors corresponding to the future or to the specific future scenarios. So across all 107 bird species, the models that included the tree species metrics had a greater model fit than the climate and terrain only models, which means they were doing a better job. So in this plot on the left, each of these dots is a bird species, and all of the green dots represent cases where the tree species model was able to better explain variation in the total incidence. And you can see the vast majority of these dots are green, meaning the trees and climate model did a better job than just the climate and terrain model. And then we could look at variable importance. So from these models, we get an idea of which individual variables are most important. And the 2 most influential drivers were a set of temperature and tree species metrics. So for 51 bird species, the top variable was a temperature metric, primarily mean July temperature or mean January temperature. And these species, as a group, tended to have pretty widespread breeding distributions, or they tended to breed in open or early successional habitat. Whereas for birds that were considered forest interior or forest gap specialists, which ended up being about 43 bird species, their top variable was a tree species metric. And the exact tree species was actually pretty variable among the different birds, but the 3 that were most frequent were red maple, balsam fir, and loblolly pine. And then one of the main things we did with this study was compare the overall trajectories of species incidence predicted by the 3 future scenarios. And we found that the bird species exhibited one of 4 main trends. So for the first trend, there was little to no difference among the 3 future scenarios. So in these plots, you can see all the lines are pretty much headed the same way and clustered pretty closely together. basically adding tree species didn't have much impact on their trajectory, and their trajectories were primarily driven by climate. And so these species, including common yellowthroat, northern cardinal, warbling vireo, and American robin, were generally most influenced by temperature metrics and had pretty widespread breeding ranges. For the second trend, there was a large difference between the climate change only scenario in yellow and the two scenarios involving trees, which are both in green. So here, adding tree species had a very large impact on their trajectory. And notably, it mediated the climate-only projection, meaning the declines that were predicted weren't as severe when we incorporated tree species. And these 4 species, ovenbird, scarlet tanager, red-eyed vireo, and veery, along with the others, tended to be forest songbirds that still had pretty large breeding ranges. For the third trend, there were large differences among all 3 future scenarios. So each scenario was kind of doing its own thing. And the highest incidence over time was predicted for the scenario with climate change and the static tree species. So the light green line was always on top. And these species, including black-throated blue warbler, red-breasted nuthatch, blue-headed vireo, and hermit thrush, tended to breed in the boreal forest or in the northern region of the eastern USA. And what these plots are telling us in terms of conservation are that maintaining contemporary tree species distributions may be critical to buffer the effects of climate change. So if we look at just climate change, we're seeing the trajectories of habitat suitability pretty much plummeting. But if we manage for tree species and try to maintain those distributions into the future, we could maintain habitat suitability, at least compared to the climate-only trajectory. And then finally, for the fourth and final trend, there were, again, large differences among all 3 scenarios, and the highest incidence over time for these species was predicted for the scenario with climate change and lagged tree species change, so the dark green line. And these species, including Kentucky warbler, summer tanager, brown-headed nuthatch, and white-breasted nuthatch, tended to breed in the southern and central regions of the eastern USA. And in terms of conservation, what these plots are telling us is that it may be critical to allow or facilitate shifting tree species distributions into the future. So if we allow that, we're seeing that tree species suitability, bird habitat suitability is increasing versus the climate-only trajectory. And then here's what those trajectories look like as maps, as an example for 4 warbler species, with current incidence on the top row, and then the corresponding future incidence on the bottom row. And here, yellow indicates pretty high habitat suitability, with those values falling as we go towards dark purple, which indicates 0 habitat suitability. And for the first 3 species, we're seeing that the habitat suitability is decreasing for the future. But for Kentucky warbler, which I just covered, they're actually seeing an increase in potential habitat suitability for the future. And as a note, we are working on sharing these maps through an online GIS platform to allow the public to explore these results and be able to zoom in to specific locations such as Connecticut. So that should be coming in the future. All right, to summarize and connect the 3 studies that I've covered this evening, I first found that the direction and strength of climate relationships changed across gradients in latitude and elevation, with implications that cold-associated species are most at risk from future climate change. However, land cover change may have more immediate and substantive effects than climate change, specifically on forest songbirds in the Appalachian Mountains during the breeding season. Based on those results, forest cover is going to be important to maintain for forest songbird conservation, but tree species may also play a role in long-term future trajectories, with different forest songbird species benefiting from different conservation strategies, so maintaining contemporary tree species distributions versus allowing them to shift in the future in response to climate change. Before I end, I do want to first thank you all for attending this presentation And I want to thank Connecticut Audubon for hosting the Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds series, and Tom Anderson for inviting me as a speaker. And then I also want to acknowledge that my research wouldn't have been possible without my collaborators and field technicians, as well as the research funding, which included several federal agencies, such as National Science Foundation, U.S. Geological Survey, and U.S. Forest Service. And with that, I think I'm happy to take any questions. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Hannah. That was so interesting. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. So I will start with the first question that I see here from Elena. So she is asking, how would birds moving north impact the environments that they are leaving? Really interesting question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Very thoughtful. So I guess if we're seeing birds leave, certain forest environments and habitats, so that's going to affect pretty much everything that they interact with in the environment. So that could be other bird species where they might be in competition. So if certain bird species that are in competition remain in that area, they may be released from that competition, and so it would benefit that bird species. However, there could be bird species where, they could have a mutualistic relationship, in which case the loss of one of those partners would be to the detriment. And of course, thinking about like other relationships with like prey. So if we lose a lot of our birds, especially forest songbirds that tend to be insectivorous, are we releasing a bunch of forest pest populations in those areas? So lots of things. And then of course there's the abiotic component where, birds are participating in nutrient cycling and affecting, all parts of the forest ecosystem. So I'm sure there would be, a lot of different repercussions if we're losing birds from habitats.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to think too, thinking about warmer temperatures and maybe less die-offs of some of those other forest pest species. And kind of going into that, we have another question from Michelle. So she says, in addition to the tree species changing due to climate change, have the effects of tree pests such as beech leaf disease or oak wilt have been used to model bird distributions? And if not, how much of an effect would you expect?
That's a great question, and actually very relevant to my postdoc position. One of the Forest Service researchers that I'm working with is a pest person, so looking at forest pests and distributions and climate change. So far, we haven't looked directly at pests and using pest distributions to model bird distributions. Right now, a lot of the research is pests and trees and the effects of climate change into the future. But I think that is a really interesting kind of research avenue, connecting birds and pests. So I guess in this case, those are tree pests that would adversely affect the trees, that would then affect the birds. But another way to look at it is a lot of tree pests are caterpillars that are being eaten by birds. So I know like when spruce budworm got released, its population kind of boomed in Canada for a while, and that actually really benefited some of our boreal warblers that were feeding on this like big new resource of food. So it's it's definitely interesting to think about the different ways that birds and pests can interact through different kind of mediators like trees.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point is that, yeah, birds are interacting a lot with these pests, in eating them, in, distributing them, sometimes, birds picking something up and dropping it. It's really interesting to think about. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. So we have a couple of questions about your high emissions model. So this is also from Michelle. She says, in the high emissions model, is the loss of tree cover due to development, or is it the impact of climate change on the trees or something else?
Yeah, so I guess it depends which research study that was referring to. So in the research study that was looking at land cover change, the loss of forest cover was it was mostly conversion to other land cover types or land uses. So like urban cover that's expanding, if it's expanding into forest, we're gonna lose that forest cover. So for that research project specifically, it was the kind of change in different land cover types from forest to something else. For the tree species distributions, the change in tree species distributions was so trees are also affected by climate. So certain trees are going to favor different climate conditions. If those conditions change, then species are going to be affected. So they might die, like I guess at the most extreme, and be extirpated from an area if conditions become too hostile for them to thrive. Um, and so that would kind of be the impetus for those tree species change is the climate itself, climate conditions in terms of temperature, precipitation, and then how they interact with like the tree's needs.
Right. No, absolutely. Well, this was so fascinating. Thank you so much, Dr. Clipp. Yeah, I'll hand it over to Joyce, but just thank you so much for your research presentation. It was so fascinating. We have a lot of other questions in the chat. So if anyone, would people be able to reach out to you with any questions?
Yeah, definitely.
Great.
Yeah, I would be happy to answer any follow-up questions.
Excellent.
Well, Lori and Hannah, thank you so much. Lori, thank you for sharing your research. It's really just, it's something we think about all the time. What are the impacts of warming climate and on our birds, plants, habitats, and wildlife? He gave us a lot to think about and consider. You know that there are still a lot of questions in the chat. So in the past, if people wanted to stay and answer a couple more questions, like we've always welcomed that opportunity to answer a couple of more. A lot of the questions do relate to your modeling of climate change with tree versus the non-tree. And I think people are thinking, like, is we thinking that the whole habitat's going to evolve along with the birds as they migrate and the climate changes. But if you're willing to stay for a few more minutes, like we can stay. But before we do that, for anybody who wants to drop off, I just want to make sure that I thank you. Your participation in this event really is what keeps us putting this event together. And I have to say that for the years that we've been putting this on, hearing from researchers like Hannah and Freda and the others who have been participating has really been eye-opening for what they're thinking and what they're considering. And when you consider, Hannah, thank you for like pointing out your funding sources. The federal government has really made much of this research available and possible. And we're hoping that that will continue in the future so that when we're bringing future presenters, they'll be able to say that this was all made possible through the federal government taking an interest in those research projects. We're always looking to make Connecticut better for birds, wildlife, and for all of us. And Hannah, your research is definitely going to help us do that better. Just a reminder for everybody that our next and final Young, Gifted, and Wild presentation will be at 7 o'clock on March 13th, and it will be Equity in Bird Watching, and I hope to see you there. And Hannah, if you're willing to stay for a few minutes, and Lori, if you're willing to ask a couple of more questions, we hope if you want to
Sure.
stay and join us. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, so we can pick up where we left off. So we had a question about high emissions model. All right, so we've got another question from Elena. If declines in forest cover are causing a lot of bird population declines, then why have climate generalist and warm associated species not had much change?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Sorry. And so I guess I'm assuming this, yeah, this has to do with the research project that was the land cover change. And so we were seeing, slight declines here and there. Overall, none of our 14 forest songbird species really changed that much in between what we modeled for 2000 to 100 years later. We were seeing declines in certain species, but not across the board. So like summer tanager was being a warm associated species, did see some declines where I think areas of, timber harvest and urbanization was taking place in the southern Appalachians. So they are still being affected, but at the kind of grand scale of the models, it wasn't like a big serious decline. Or yeah. So yeah, I would say like declines in forest cover are still affecting the warm associated and climate general species.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Super interesting. All right, let's see. Okay, so another question. Why are declines not as severe when including trees? Shouldn't they be worse considering decreases in forests that birds depend on, especially since the trees will also suffer from climate change?
Yeah, so part of that, I think there's a couple things going on. So when you think about forest birds and you're including both trees and climate, when we let the trees when we use the current distributions of trees for the future, we're essentially maintaining that habitat. So we're not saying that those trees are being lost. And so the habitat is still there and the climate is changing, but as I kind of showed in that second project, the climate doesn't seem to be changing enough that it would across the board affect the bird species and drive them entirely out. So they still have their forest habitat. And there's a couple of unique things about forest habitat where um, and I don't have the data to back this up for my project specifically, but other people have found that mature forests, especially extensive tracts of forest, will often buffer temperature changes. So you're going to have less or a reduced temperature increase under forest canopy. So there's microclimates. So within the forest, it's generally cooler than, say, an open habitat that would be adjacent to the forest. So the entire area could be warming at the same rate, but you're going to have less warming in the forest. And so forests themselves can almost buffer certain parts of warming climate. And then when we allow trees to shift in distribution, so following or allowing them to shift in response to climate change, I think for a lot of the species that we were seeing increasing habitat suitability, it was that those trees are shifting north. And so a lot of the birds that were kind of central and southern distributions within the eastern USA were then able to access habitat that is shifting north. And so those models actually predicting expansions of habitat suitability following the trees shifting north. So I think that's what's happening for those birds.
Wow. Yeah, that's so interesting. And especially thinking about, temperature too, because I was imagining that as you were showing, there's different cover types. I've read a lot about cities being really hot and how, like urban forestry is really great because it can reduce temperature in a lot of those areas. So when you had those two figures next to each other, I was thinking the very same thing. So super interesting. All right. So let's see. We got that question. Someone was asking what species of bird was the tan bird with an orange throat. I'm not sure, but maybe it was the Blackburnian warbler. They're pretty spectacular. I'm not sure which bird he's referring to, but they've got a pretty awesome orange throat. All right. So another question from Kathy. Would planting of tree species need to be similar to a forest setting, parentheses close, or would planting isolated trees in a backyard help? Oh, I think they mean like if all you could do was, like plant one tree in your backyard, would it have an impact versus if you would plant, maybe dozens of trees
Mhm.
somewhere else?
Yeah, I would say it's going to have a local impact for sure. Um, you know, at the scale of a bird's range and like larger distribution, you know, one or a couple of trees in a backyard isn't going to shift things too much, but at the local level, for sure, it's going to have an impact on like your local backyard birds, especially if you plant native and, you know, like our native oaks support so many different caterpillars, which are then very important for our breeding birds for feeding their young. So, yeah, so I
Yeah.
think definitely a local effect.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I couldn't recommend more. Yeah, oaks are awesome, very diverse. Everything loves eating acorns and all the different insects that they provide shelter for. All right, I think that was our last question. Were there any other ones that I missed in the chat? I think that was it. Um, Great. Well, thank you so much again. This was so fascinating. And for me too, there's a lot that I'll be thinking about for a long time. It was just really, really interesting and, fascinating to think about, how can we all do our best to help support our bird populations and our tree populations and our flowers and shrubs and all the different things that, make the environment for the birds we like to see. So yes, thank you so much. And yeah, any other questions, feel free to reach out to me and we can facilitate them to Dr. Clipp. So yeah, if you have any other questions, send them along.
Yep, thank you again for having me.
Great. Thank you
Yes,
so
thank
much.
you.